Coming up, all is quiet on the Brooklyn front as the Nets do not make any trades ahead of the deadline. Cam Johnson remains here, but could Ben Simmons be bought out? We dive in next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marvick. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And Doug, just like we're doing it for the first time, let's talk about the trade deadline and the Brooklyn Nets.
Well, what's there to talk about? Prep the show with a whole lot of nothing.
Let's head out the door.
Nothing to talk about. I mean, we kind of feared this was to happen. If you watched our pre-deadline show that we recorded last night, we both made guesses that the number would be on the low side. I said 0 moves. I think you said 1 maybe. And
one. I want to be optimistic. Say something happened, but you know
that's right. Because I'm about to take an L on something else here, but that's fine. But the overall, we thought that there was a chance it was going to be a pretty quiet deadline for the Nets. It seemed like the market had probably shifted away from them trading anybody. You always want to be surprised and feel like there's going to be a deal that just comes out of the woodwork, or a team gets interested at the last second. And there were some other overall, the trade deadline day was not that interesting. The trade deadline itself was, intensely interesting. There was a lot, between Luka alone. Luka alone makes the whole thing. But and Jimmy Butler, who got traded right after we finished podcasting last night. Brandon Ingram on the move. Some other lower level guys like Bogdanovich. We'll talk about DeAndre Hunter. So there were other dudes that ended up moving around. But in terms of the Nets, Sean Marks stands pat. We feared that was going to happen. Could be that the market never really opened up for something that he wanted. And there's going to be a group of fans out there that are going to be pissed because they're going to say, well, this is not the point. And, we could try to talk you down a little bit. But overall, I don't think from this podcast standpoint that we're really all that surprised.
No, not surprised by it. And as you say, I think just from a net-centric standpoint, I want to use the Atlanta trade maybe as a barometer for what could have been. Would you have wanted it to be something on the table for the Brooklyn Nets when it comes to Cam Johnson? You said talk people off the ledge. I'll tell you up front, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that Cam Johnson's still a Brooklyn Net. If you're worried about wins and losses, we can talk about Toronto. They made a move. Doesn't look like they're going to lack for being competitive over the remainder of this season, obviously, with Ingram there. But from a Nets perspective, Cam Johnson's been on this team. Now, he's played and hasn't played. He's helped them win games and helped them not win games. Same thing with D'Angelo Russell. I think that at a certain point, if you're the Nets front office, you have to look at it and say, Jordi Fernandez, as we've talked about before, is going to keep this team highly competitive. As you get into the latter stages of the season, it's always easier to shut a few guys down. Cam Thomas is going to be on his way back here, hopefully over the next couple of weeks. But in the end, I just don't know if it mattered that much to where the Nets are right now and what's going to happen over the rest of the season. Though I do want to pose an interesting question to you about where this team goes over the last, 30 odd games here this year.
Yeah, I think that they probably looked at the situation and they were like, well, we already have all these games in the bag. We're probably not, we're not going to win a crazy amount going forward. But we're also not going to just get down to we're probably just not going to be able to get down to the level of, for sure, Washington and then some of these other teams, like maybe even Charlotte. It's going to be hard to probably get there. And so I wonder if that was part of the calculus too, where they're just thinking, well, at this point, no one's coming around for multiple firsts for Cam Johnson. I think we kind of knew that was going to be the case. Yep. And no one's coming around with multiple firsts. Some chance no one was even coming with a first. Plus a player that was going to need to match salary, whatever. And so at that point, it's like, well, he's a great guy. We like having him around here. Maybe we decide later the contract's not terrible for especially how he's playing now. And we just kind of see what happens. And it's a little bit fraught with Peroka's injury, but overall, and that, that's just was the market for him. And I just don't think there was a market for anybody else. I don't think anyone, I doubt that anyone even really came crazy calling for anyone else on the rosters is my guess, right? Like D'Lo, Claxton, Sharp, any of the guys that we talked about. So I just think that it probably, my guess is the phone was pretty quiet. We kind of already knew. They had kind of signaled that the Cam Johnson market just really wasn't materializing in the way the Nets wanted. So It just is what it is. You can't just go accept anything, right? Like, and that's kind of like where I stopped. That's where I stopped short of just being like so pissed off that they didn't do anything. I'm not convinced there was a lot of anything that came in. Like, I just don't. That's just kind of, that's my guess at least.
And where I assume most of the fans that are potentially upset or disappointed or disgusted at having not moved off from Cam Johnson specifically, I think they'd be the same group of fans that if the Nets had moved him and the return wasn't right, would be in here saying, well, how could you possibly? You didn't get enough for him. You didn't get player X, whatever the case may have been. And I know when all these parts are moving around, it's easy to get overexcited and think that you want to be involved in it. And I said, I think we've mentioned this before a couple of times over the last couple of weeks. I'm going to say it again here. The Nets haven't lost any of the flexibility around Cam Johnson specifically either here. There's the offseason. There's what's going on in Milwaukee. What is that going to look like when it comes to Giannis and everything else? There's also the draft. Yes, the Nets are currently right now 6th in on the board there in terms of odds to have the first overall pick, or 9% to have the first overall, 37% to be in the top 4. But they're also picking 20th from Milwaukee, 25th and 26th from Houston and New York, respectively. So there's going to be a world where you want to have those conversations. What about the teams that couldn't make the moves at the deadline this year, right? That still want to improve themselves in the offseason. I still think we'll be back at the table having different conversations. Remember, we mentioned OKC as being one of those off-season teams that could come calling about Cam Johnson after they let this iteration of their roster play it through the playoffs and, in their minds, hopefully a trip to the NBA finals and maybe more, right? So that's the part, that's, I think, where I keep a cool head, is that there's flexibility here for Brooklyn. They haven't lost anything by not pulling the trigger on a deal now.
And also too, like, I'm not letting Marks off the hook here. We've taken him to task at times where it looks like he's like held on the guys too long, right? I think that's for sure been the case with him. So I don't think there's anything that signals, like, there's nothing that I would take back from other things I've said about that. I do think there's my guess is there was a situation here where you can't just call people and just be like, give me a first. Like, it just doesn't work that way. If no one's interested, then, like, who were the teams? Like, we just don't know. It didn't seem like that was materializing in really any way. We don't know what he turned down. We don't know if there was anything. I'm not going to speculate on that. Maybe we hear in future weeks that they're like, oh, they turned down a first and a player. Then we can get pissed about that, I think. But overall, I just didn't get the sense really at any point that there was like that these guys he was going to get blown out of the water for Cam Johnson. Like, take what we said about Houston. Remember we talked about Cam Johnson? We're like, oh, maybe Houston comes calling. And then we looked at it and he said he wouldn't even start. He wouldn't even start for Houston probably if they were fully healthy. And then at that point, what's a team like that even going to reasonably offer to send? I'm just making the situation up for Houston, but I'm just saying, like, this is the kind of player you're dealing with. Some teams he'd be a clear for sure starter. Some teams it would be like close. If they were like these really high caliber teams that could come calling for him, some it would just be a clear he wouldn't. And at that point, like, are you going to trade first round picks for a guy in his mid-20s, even though he's shooting the lights out and he's been super efficient? Are you trading first round picks for a guy who gets to come off the bench and doesn't really, light it up in terms of like highlight reel stuff? He's just not going to do that. So I'm just really not. That's just, in the end, that's just where I'm not really surprised that nothing ever really came about. And he's like not the worst guy to keep either.
Yeah, yes, there's that part of it too. It's like he's a well-regarded veteran, right? Now, listen, the last thing I'll say here on Cam Johnson and the Nets trade deadline, lack of deals. If you turn around, as we mentioned last night in the episode, turn around and tell me the Spurs came calling and they offered a first and a young player that they got a handful of, I'll feel differently about it. But there wasn't even that speculation that something was in the offing. This, if anything, felt like either Sean Marks and the Nets needed to pull this trigger a month ago, like do it on the very front foot of everything, or we anticipated these kind of be the waters that they were going to be in. Coming up here in a second, Atlanta did make a deal. By the way, it looks like they're going a different direction here potentially as they move forward. We'll talk about that package that they had there with the Cleveland Cavaliers, if that's a deal that Nets fans wished Sean Marks had been in on, and also some other movement here. How does it impact where the Nets will be in tankathon standings by the end of the year? Plus, Ben Simmons. Is the buyout on the way? And does Doug have the proverbial egg on his face? We'll get there in just one moment.
All right, let you know with Robinhood Gold, you can now enjoy the VIP treatment, receiving a 3% IRA match on retirement contributions. The privileges of the very privileged are no longer exclusive. With Robinhood Gold, your annual IRA contributions are boosted by 3%. Plus, you also get 4% APY on your cash and non-retirement accounts. That's over 8x the national savings average. The perks of the high net worth are now available for any net worth. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. To receive your 3% bonus on annual IRA contributions, sign up at Robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risks. Rates subject to change. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold at $5 per month for 1 year from first match. Must keep funds in IRA for 5 years. Go to Robinhood.com/boost. Over 8x the national average savings accounts. Interest rate claim is based on data from the FDIC as of November 18, 2024. For Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold LLC.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the NBA deadline, all was silent from a Brooklyn Nets perspective. I do want to get to the Atlanta Hawks trade. I think that's interesting as far as what could have been a comp maybe for Cam Johnson, but I don't know what's worse here, Doug, that you so staunchly planted your flag in the Ben Simmons will never be bought out mountain and have lived and died on that hill, my friend, or is it far worse that like I've backed you this entire time? I've almost been as adamant in my support of your stance. I don't know which is worse, but there is some speculation that Ben Simmons could be a buyout candidate. I think we're both pretty surprised by it. And I guess maybe it just signals where Ben Simmons could be at in terms of what he wants the next chapter of his NBA career to look like, willing to potentially sacrifice a lot of money here to be able to go get on another team and reset the perception of him around the league potentially.
Yeah, I mean, as of this recording, he has not been bought out, just a heads up. No. So it's been speculated, and it's not just Shams did speculate on it, and that feels like it's probably like closer to happening than not. So, but just to make sure our T's are dotted and our I's are crossed, like he has not, as of this moment, been bought out. But correct. I'm still surprised it's even this far. I've long held the stand that he would not be bought out because he just wouldn't want to give up money. And I just didn't think there would be a team of groups of willing suitors who would be, because the worst you get bought out and then no one picks you up because then you just like lose the money. Right. And so, before you're bought out, you kind of know through back channels of like teams that are going to just sign you. And there's not even every team can sign him, because if you're over the second apron, you're not available to sign like I think it's like $12.8 million mid-level exception, which is where he lands. So I don't know. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. I'm prepared. We battened down the hatches here to take the loss. And so I just would be surprised if a team was like, hey, he's going to be a difference maker. But if it's just going to cost almost no money and they just need some backup stuff and could use a wing defender and have shooters, then yeah, I mean, you might as well try. I just didn't think it would materialize, and it looks like I want to be wrong.
Incidentally, though, too, I want to be very upfront here. If he doesn't get bought out, we're coming right back in. We're going just as hard the other way, hammering how much conviction we've had all along that it wasn't going to happen.
I'll just let everyone know, of course. I really actually think it's going to happen now. This usually doesn't get
percolate.
The only piece of it is like it's floated out there because they want to gauge interest to see who actually would be interested. It's like, hey, we're thinking about getting bought out. Let's gauge some interest. But I don't know. Usually when this kind of stuff happens, it especially coming from Shams, it does go through. I'm just saying. But again, we'll see. I bet you we'll know in the next day or two.
The interesting part about it is, too, I mean, second apron team-wise, now this may have shifted since the start of this. I'm over on Spot Track as the reference point here. There's only 4 teams that are second apron right now, and that's the Knicks, the Lakers, the Nuggets, and the Pacers, although the Pacers were moving some money around the deadline. So there's a lot of things that happened here that felt like, what is this? Why does it matter? A lot of it was sending players in cash for things to try to get themselves under certain apron thresholds across the league as well. So it'd be interesting to see what teams, as you say, would be interested in Ben Simmons. Like not even for speculation's sake, but I find the simple fact that and we can talk about any of these other trades that went down, the fact that Jimmy Butler ended up in Golden State, just immediately go, well, why they'll be looking for anybody here. Like they're trying to once again push the door back open here on Steph Curry's, timeline and what he has left to maybe go and compete for championships. If you're Ben Simmons, I think that's what you're looking for. You're looking for this sweet landing spot where you can maybe come in and be a part of the bolster to a team that doesn't currently sit there or wasn't currently sitting there saying, we still want to try to go for a championship. We still want to go for a deep playoff run. And then at the deadline, made moves to try to throw themselves back into that conversation. I find teams like that to be interesting if he does get bought out.
Oh yeah, and actually, let me just give you this like set list here because a friend of the show, Yossi Goslin, did have this list. I knew there was an exact list.
This guy tends to be
the
numbers.
The exact list is actually above first apron, so I was wrong about this. It's the Celtics, Nuggets, Lakers, Bucks, Wolves, Knicks, and Suns can't sign him, just because of where he would be in the 12.8 mid level. So that's the team that can't. Cleveland was mentioned as a possible team. The Clippers were mentioned as a possible team. Again, who knows, but.
I'm never going to not throw out the Spurs as a team. I'm going to keep throwing out the Spurs for every player every time.
Yeah, look, I want him to win. I want this guy to land in a place. I would like it to work out for him. I would like to, I just don't really root against anybody at this point. We've long said we thought the ship had sailed on him, but if other teams see it differently and he has a chance to kind of get on a good team that's going to really highlight his skills and they're going to play him, great. Yep. I don't know. I understand why they can never trade him. It was just the contract was totally untradeable to the point where I thought it was unbuyoutable too. But if that's what ends up happening, and this is the biggest deal the Nets make post deadline is that they buy out Ben Simmons. I'm sure fans, there's gonna be a certain segment of fans that are happy, I guess. And I don't know if we would count us among them, but I just think that kind of is what it is at this point.
Yeah, I'd be happy for him. I think sometimes people listen to us and we're critical of Ben Simmons from the basketball standpoint, from the contract standpoint, right, and where his game is. It doesn't mean we have nothing but the best. I hope he goes someplace that he can win, right? I hope he ends up getting another massive contract. It means nothing to me as far as where he lands. This season, just to round it out on Ben Simmons, played in 33 games, started 24, was averaging 25 minutes a night. He was giving you 54%, almost 55% from the field, and was hitting 69% from the free throw line on almost a free throw attempt per game. So that's where we stood on him. He gave you 7 assists. That was the high water mark, 6.9, the high water mark since being a part of Brooklyn. And 7 assists per game would get him back to when he was playing more substantial minutes. That's back in the 2018, 19, 20 range when he was playing 30, 33 minutes a night. So there is something there. If you're a team and he does get bought out, you probably can look at some of these numbers and say, hey, he was doing that with what we believe to be one of the weakest, if not the weakest roster in the NBA. What could he do if you put him around some real elite talent in the league, even in small chunks? So we'll see where things shake out from there. Any other ones before we get into this? No, you know what? We'll get into it. Coming up here on the other side, let's talk about this Atlanta Hawks deal with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Is that something that should have happened for Brooklyn? And also, buyout candidates. Will the Nets take any little flyers on some low-level guys, young talent that may be on the market here for the rest of the season? We'll do that coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you my friends over at Game Time looking for tickets for your next big event, whether it's a concert, comedy show, or sports event. Finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache, but with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. Let's see how this thing works. Game Time Picks, an app, does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals. You don't have to waste a bunch of time searching through endless ticket listings. Using Game Time Picks, you got to love it. It's curated deals, makes it so simple. You're going to find the best tickets at great prices. You can grab the super deals, prime seats. What value you're going to go over there and find right now with the Nets. Listen to some of these prices. Now, this is what happens when you're in the tank. But Heat at Nets coming up on Friday, starting at $12. Hornets at Nets. You want to take a guess? Quick. Hornets at Nets. Lowest ticket cost.
$4.
Close. $5. Starting at $5. It kind of goes up from there. We got Sixers starting at 11, Cavs starting at 29. You're not going to get better deals than this than our friends over at Game Time. You're covered with Game Time's lowest price guarantee as well. They'll refund you 110% of the difference if you can find a lower price. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create that account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we tie a pretty little bow on today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the deadline, no moves for the Brooklyn Nets. Everybody stays. You didn't even hear any chatter. And I always, as you mentioned, even about Cam Johnson, fun to see if you heard any calls were made about D'Angelo Russell, right? Any calls were made about Day'Ron Sharpe. It just, I like to hear them. I'm not going to necessarily, unless it was something seismic, judge Sean Marks for it. But it just, as of right now, don't get the impression that anyone was calling Brooklyn about anything. But there was this deal that went down that I thought was worth discussing, where the Cleveland Cavaliers ended up landing DeAndre Hunter from the Hawks for Karis LeVert George Niang, and 3 second-round picks plus 2 swaps. And that was reported by Shams Charania. Brian Windhorst gave the backup of the swaps for the Cavs are 26 and 28, which means they are swaps on swaps, which is that classic narrative Doug and I always talk about. You have to really have a degree in rocket science to figure out all the moving parts around this stuff. But that deal right there, you think Nets fans look at that and go, well, where was Brooklyn? Call Cleveland and say, exact same deal. Cam Johnson, all the same stuff. Let's do it. Do you think that that's going to be something that Nets fans hold on to here?
The second round picks? No, because is that what you mean? Like if they got second round picks and like Levert and Nang for them, like you're comparing it 1-to-1. Nah, they'd be pissed. Like because these second round picks and the swaps and stuff, like who even knows? They're probably gonna end up in seconds. I just think that this is just there's no way Marks was gonna do that. I could have told you, easily. There's no way Marks is gonna do it. I don't see how you're gonna look at that and think like there's anything lost, right? In getting those back. The two guys were just salary fodder, and the picks are going to be most times dudes that don't land in the NBA. And I just think at that point, when you have a guy as good as Cam Johnson, who I think is probably better than DeAndre Hunter, then you just don't, there's no real point in doing something like that, especially when you have such a picks bank as it is. Because remember, like all those picks, like those guys are going to have roster spots too. Like it's not like it's not like the Nets can just look at this and we can look at this and say, oh, there's going to be spots for all these guys they drafted. There's just not going to be. And so I just don't think at that point you need to just send them out just for a few more bites at the lower end apple. So I don't think there's a reason to look at that and think, oh, there was something crazy lost here. It doesn't strike me as that particular deal does not strike me as like, oh, the one that got away, if it was on the table, which it probably was, honestly. But I just don't think that that's something that should, like, no one needs to worry about that one.
And that's, I think, a part of it to remind everybody about. Look around the league, look at some of the deals and say, like, oh, could that have been the Cam Johnson destination? And that's why I brought up the Cavs one, because that wasn't going to cut it. I talked with Danny Cunningham from Locked On Cavs, and he said, yes, the Cavs would love to have Cam Johnson on that team. He asked me if I thought it was possible. I said, no, I don't think you have the players, the pieces. You don't have the draft picks because Cavs did not have the first round capital to be able to send out either in any of these deals. So it was like, sorry, it's not going to work out. So at that point, you just start to look around. And the only thing that I wondered about was, do you think that any of these teams at the top, so like OKC, I said before, they can wait for the offseason and rehab this discussion. Did any of the other moves happening around the league make you feel like, oh, well, maybe the top team should have thought about bolstering themselves a little bit more here? A lot of this was about like the back end pack of the conferences, right? That tried to make these moves to vault themselves into a more competitive position. Whereas, the Cavs count as one of the teams that made a big swing here, but in the Western Conference, especially, the top couple of teams didn't do anything of substance here.
Well, OKC didn't, right? But you thought maybe the Rockets might, right? Like try to consolidate. It did seem like a lot of people called on KD. KD seemed like they were open for business on him, and that's going to be a discussion for a discussion for a different day, because like the Suns were definitely open for it, and maybe I think the Grizzlies called. It seemed like the Golden State Warriors were in the mix there for a while, and that never materialized. So that they tried to make that happen. The Rockets didn't do anything. OKC didn't really do anything really of note. A little surprised with OKC because it does feel like a window is now for them, but maybe they just look and say, hey, we're just good. I'm not sure they need to get so much better, or they not so many different ways they can improve. We already talked about the Lakers, just going through a couple of these other trades. Obviously, we talked about the Fox one too. So there were a bunch of deals here, but it was just like kind of all happened before today, right? Yeah. Like after these, I will say the Lakers getting Mark Williams. Lakers, I have to say, like the Lakers thing, they need to have like some kind of federal investigation. Like how on earth, like these guys got Luka, Mark Williams. They have like I know they give up Anthony Davis, but they got the Luka thing alone. Then they just like, oh, we need a center. We'll take your center over here, who's got like absolute just mind-boggling fantasy numbers. Mark Williams does this year,
built to catch lobs from maybe two of the best passers in the game, Luka and LeBron, right? Like just
rebounds and shore up like the interior stuff and can rim run and just is really good rebounder. It's like, oh, well now they're kind of looking great. They got their own problems too, but it's just like so funny with the Lakers. Like there's like nothing ever matters for them. They just it all works out. It all works out. Like I just don't really understand. But anyway, I think that the rest of these moves, Middleton for Kuzma, kind of a nothing. Nothing really was ground shaking for me here. Even guys like Bogdan Bogdanović, who got traded. He's had his injury problems. He's getting a little older. He went for, Terrence Mann, Bones Highland, and they sent picks with him. It was like the 3 second-round picks plus Bogdan, and then they got back Terrence Mann, who was playing, and Bones Highland, who was just basically like total end of the bench. So
other Bogdanovich in Brooklyn, by the way, it's like you want to talk about, oh, what about him? Whatever. Well, guess what?
He might get bought out.
Yeah, he will. But I was going to say, though, it's like, oh, any idea of moving any of these guys? Like, think about the worst case scenario where you're attaching the picks to move somebody, right? Like that would be the absolute worst case scenario for Brooklyn this deadline too. Atlanta is such a funky team, man. I don't know what they are going to be.
They're going to blow it up, I think.
And bookending their draft when it was, the choice to not take Luka, to not have Luka and go with Trey. It's all come full circle around this deadline for them as well.
They might blow it up and see if they can trade Trey again. I'm not really sure. Like the Jalen Johnson getting hurt kind of killed them, and so they haven't seemed like they know if they're coming or going. Like they traded DeJounte, but then they have all these picks going out to the Spurs because they traded for DeJounte. It's been kind of a mess there. By the way, it's a good example. Who knows where the Nets land? The Hawks are a good example where you get caught in the in between, where you aren't. And they had that. They had the run to the Eastern Conference Finals a couple years ago, which was like kind of a fluke. And then they're caught in between because it's like, well, is Trey the guy? Well, he's not really. And now we're going to kind of build around them, but then the ceiling is just completely capped. And then you do a bunch of random stuff to try to get like marginally better around guys who just aren't the like top 10 players in the league. We talk about these top 10 guys all the time. Like you just have to all the time hold out for these top 10 guys. Like you just can't, you can't screw around in this other area and overpay guys 10 through 20 to be your best player. And I get why you kind of have to do it because there's only 10 guys and there's 30 teams or whatever. But like, this is a good example of what happens when you get caught in the in-between, and like where thankfully the Nets like kind of blew it up because it just doesn't go very well. And then you throw good money after bad, and now they get these Spurs picks that are out to bring in DeJounte. It didn't work. Neither of those two guys were top 10 players, and now it's just a mess. So anyway, I'll always go for just superstars or bust should always be the trajectory. And if you can't get the superstar, just do something else, which is why I'm sure like just drives people nuts that the Nets have 17 wins, but whatever. You get my point.
No, 100%. But and that's why it's so difficult, as you say. You don't want to overpay for somebody, but then you don't pay for them, and you had them, and then the fan base freaks out because you didn't pay them, and now you have nobody, and you're trying to chase that guy all the time. Last couple of things I want to get to. Obviously, the Nets will play on Monday, so we can come back around. I think, buyout market wise, whether the Nets do something with Ben Simmons or not, the Nets aren't going to be a team that is adding a lot of players. In that landscape, it's usually veteran teams that have playoff aspirations, but I wanted to throw out the fact that there is a player who once upon a time in the G League was knocking down 47% from the field, but 43 from beyond the arc. The stats at the NBA level, well, they're not robust. He hasn't played a lot, 21 games. But Jalen Hood-Schifino got sent over to the Utah Jazz in a deal, and then he's going to get cut. We talked about him. If he ends up like, the only thing the Nets should do is think about picking up young guys to get looks at him. Pick up a young player and give him to Jordi Fernandez and say, well, see if there's something there. See if there's something worth keeping here this offseason and into a training camp and see what could be. I want to make sure to throw that name out there because I have brought him up a couple of times when we've discussed trades over there with LA the last couple of years.
Yeah. I will say it's wild to go from like 17th pick to basically just cut in 2 years. So that one is
he played 21 games as a rookie, 2 games this year. So,
and like just to be, it's really rare to go see, like I said, a 17th overall pick. Even if you thought it was a reach on the pick, which I don't really think it was. Maybe it was a little reach at the time, like maybe slightly surprising. I'm trying to think back to that draft. But to go from 17th to in less than 2 years, essentially, or 2 years, waived is not easy to do. I'm all for just the Nets trying whatever because why not? Right? That's just where they are. But like it does have a little bit of like those Keon Johnson vibes where it's like, well, hold on. Like you're a first round pick, but why is it like not sticking here? And like, why do you keep getting shuffled around and teams just don't want you at all? I don't know. People can make mistakes and maybe he just is a great player, but I don't know. It's very odd. You really don't see that kind of thing happen when there's no like sort of nefarious story behind it. It's just kind of like
Right.
maybe just all basketball. Maybe just all
Yeah,
basketball. And
just
you're
not
like,
so
oh, that's
good.
kind of
Just
weird.
not so good at
Yeah,
basketball.
right.
It is the big story here. Last thing I'll just note here. We'll come back on Monday, talk about other buyout guys. I'm sure at some point fans are going to start asking about Killian Hayes and bringing him up to the big show here for the rest of the season. The last note is just the tankathon. The Nets are 6th. Toronto got better. Atlanta is sending that pick to San Antonio. So while they may be bad, they're still probably going to keep winning some games in form or fashion. Chicago in the mix there as well. I just want, and we've talked about this all season long, so don't get me wrong. I know I've been on the pendulum with it, but remember what, like, when people talk about like getting in there, the Nets have a 37.2% chance to land a top 4 pick right now, and they have a 9% chance to number 1 overall. It's 14% if you're Washington. So the fact that Washington has 9 wins and the Nets have 17, it equals up to a 5% difference in landing the number 1, and it equals 23, 24% in terms of being able to be in the top 4. We don't know where they're going to land. Go run the sims. If you run 30 of those simulations, about 10 to 15 of them are going to be in the top 5. I guarantee you. That's probably the range where they end up falling. So I think there's some of that too here. The deadline's over. The Nets aren't going to make any moves. We'll see what happens with buyouts, but they are pretty much locked in there to that top 6, potentially top 5 kind of range. And it still is a bit of a coin toss here. It's not because they're not top 4 does not mean that they are locked out of getting a top 4 pick. It's something I think fans are going to have to remember and remind themselves over the remaining 30 games or so.
That's probably all we're going to talk about for like the last couple of months here.
Yeah.
This is just where the Nets are. They went through the trade deadline. The team is what it is. Maybe some of these guys aren't getting bought out. We're going to be talking a lot about.
Maybe we'll talk about the Nets making the play-in. We never know.
I mean, we'll talk draft stuff and just thinking about where they're going to land and, with the ideas around that it's going to be maybe 6, 7, which is going to drive people nuts. You make a good point as always, like even landing with the worst odds in the league doesn't guarantee you anything, of which every single person for months and months and months on Twitter wanted to tell me, like, as if there was no understanding there. I get it. So, but
Doug, what you don't get here, let me explain it to you.
Finishing last doesn't guarantee the first pick. Tell me more. Like, oh, thanks. Okay, so anyway,
I was looking at NFL Tankathon. I was confused. That's the problem there.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, well, with that sarcastic note, we will get out of here. Appreciate everyone coming, rocking with us. The Twitter stuff's been super fun. Adam and I look, give a follow. Both of our names, at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie. Just give a follow on Twitter. We're doing group therapy over there on Twitter all through the season. So give a follow. If you're over on X, make sure you subscribe to the podcast as well.
If every instinct you've had is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right. And that is one Jerome Seinfeld.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets and one of the all-time great thought experiments by a character ever.
Yes.
We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. I live at home with my parents and I have no job. Basketball, yeah.